welcome to This is USG, a video podcast by the universities at Shady Grove. 9 universities, 1 campus, great results. I'm Ann Kademian, Executive Director of USG. Today, we're going to dive into the issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and the role these critically important values play in today's most forward-thinking organizations and institutions. Joining me for today's conversation is Dr. Marilyn, Lynk, Executive Director for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for Adventist Healthcare, and previously served as the chair of the Leadership Montgomery Board of Directors. Dr. Lynk, welcome to This is USG.
Great to be here. Good to see you, Ann.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I wonder if we could start with a little bit of your own personal journey. This role at leading on diversity, equity, and inclusion is so critical, so important for organizations in all industries, and is a very challenging role, but so strategically and critically important going forward. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your own journey to this role and a little bit about your own background that can help us understand why you chose this role to lead in.
Sure. Well, I actually started in this role in 2019. So it was right before the pandemic started, right before George Floyd's murder. And this was a time where we were thinking we might have a couple of years to really plan how we wanted to strategize our work to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion in our organization. And we had to really move very quickly to focus on listening to our workforce, understanding what they were experiencing, particularly because we're in healthcare. So there was a lot of feedback, a lot of input from our workforce about what they needed and what they were experiencing so that they could get through the pandemic. Before I came into this role, which is part of our HR function, I was actually the executive director for Center for Health Equity and Wellness. And our focus was on promoting health equity and improving community health. And so that was a culmination of our leadership coming together, participating and partnering with our community partners. I was also teaching at the University of Maryland, and so we had academic partners and really trying to focus on how can we meet the needs of a very rapidly changing demographic in our service area and our community. So my role now really is a culmination of focusing on that external focus on improving community health and engaging with our partners, but continuing to do that work as we are engaging our own workforce. How do we focus on attracting diverse talent, developing our leaders and skills, leaders and workforce so that they can have really good skills for meeting the needs of our diverse communities. So nice intersection of doing that work. I actually have a degree in social psychology. And so my background in social psychology kind of led me here. I didn't think I would be in public health or in healthcare at this point, but there was a really nice synergy of my academic background, some practice and research, but also just being able to meet a mission of an organization that focuses on physical, mental, and spiritual healing.
Yeah, what an interesting, as you say, culmination of so many different backgrounds and experiences. I wonder if you could say a little bit about your expertise in social psychology. That's so interesting. Tell us a little bit about what that entails, because your work when you were leading the center on which you mentioned, looking at health disparities and community health, I imagine that degree and that expertise was really important, combining both the social and the personal as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that degree and how that informed the work that you were doing, especially at the center, when you were focused on health disparities and the research around that?
Right. So when I started at Adventist Healthcare, I had just left the National Academies of Sciences. And there I did a lot of technical research. I wrote a report that focused on measuring racial discrimination. And I had just had 5 years of experience right after getting my doctorate degree. And in my graduate studies, I focused on unconscious bias. And so just being able to understand how unconscious bias works, how our brains work to manage all the information that we're receiving, and then trying to figure out what we pay attention to, and then how we actually do that in a workforce environment, came from my very kind of basic research background, where I did some studies on unconscious bias, but then being able to translate that into the work that I did at the National Academies, into a report, a technical report, working with lots of experts all over the country, and then being able to bring that and apply it within an organization, and thinking about how do I help people to raise awareness about their own unconscious bias when they're hiring, when they're selecting people for jobs, when they're promoting individuals, and then build some skill around mitigating that bias. That's really how my background, my educational experience kind of came together when I came into the workforce right after school, and then ultimately into my role now, where we do a lot of this work to really focus on education and training for our workforce around unconscious bias.
What a fascinating journey. Beginning with the research and the kind of scholarly interest, documenting, measuring, assessing, and then bringing that to a report, and then figuring out how to apply that, and then how to change behavior. That is a fascinating journey. What are your takeaways in that journey? As you reflect back on all of those really critically important stages, each of which is a really very particular kind of expertise that you have to develop for each of those. But, as we think about these big challenges that we're facing, you highlighted that you took the job just before George Floyd's murder, before the Black Lives Matter movement. And the scale and scope of the work we have to do is tremendous. And you have seen from the very beginning with research, and then taking it to the technical report, and then you're thinking about application. You have a view of this challenge that very few people have. I wonder if you could talk about some of the lessons learned that you have in looking at that journey and thinking about what it takes to not only document the need for change, but to try to bring that change as well.
Sure. One of the things I tell my students that I precept, because I've had lots of undergrad and graduate interns throughout the years, is that you never quite know what path you're going to end up on. So all of the preparation, the technical skill, and the knowledge that I had leaving was very helpful when I was in the workplace. But being able to understand how people interact, understand the importance of relationships, and understand how we need to move from kind of the everyday, taking action, to really understanding what is the impact of that action. How can we influence people to act? Those are things that I find that I've learned in my own experience. One of the things that we did recently was work with the previous leader for learning, leadership, and organizational development for our workforce of emerging leaders. And those are individuals who are posed to really step into a leadership role. We have a very diverse workforce. And so identifying those individuals that are ready to take on the new roles also aligns with our strategy to advance EDI, because we want to make sure that workforce and leadership are diverse. We focused on making sure that selection criteria were clear, that we communicated across the organization. And we found that with that focus, we had a group of people in the cohort that reflected the workforce really well. So just being able to get the data, to collect that information, to understand and interpret the information and lead to action are some of the lessons that I certainly learned. But those relationships, that's what's really important, to understand what are we ultimately wanting for this organization in terms of representation, in terms of inclusion, and in terms of equity.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about Adventist Healthcare itself before we dig into more of the professional development work. Tell us a bit about Adventist Healthcare. I think many people are familiar with the hospitals, but what's the breadth of work and engagement involved with Adventist? You have a strong community health engagement piece of this too, and maybe talk a little bit about what community health means at Adventist as well.
Yeah, that's right. So Adventist Healthcare is one of the largest employers in Montgomery County, Maryland. We are an anchor institution. We have over 6,000 people in our workforce, 1,800 physicians and medical staff. We see over 100,000 people in our admissions, and do have quite a lot of community events and activities. They were, reduced during the pandemic, but we continue to really leverage these partnerships. In addition to our acute care hospitals, we have 3 acute care hospitals. There's a rehabilitation hospital. We also have our physician services. We have urgent care, imaging. There's an emergency center in Germantown. So there's quite a lot of services that we provide to the community. But we also try to understand what are those community identified needs beyond just healthcare needs. We do a community health needs assessment to really understand what those needs are. And we leverage our partners to address some of those social and economic and cultural needs of our patient population and our community. Some of the outreach that we've done is just making sure people understand what their health needs are in terms of screening. So blood pressure screening. We also provide education like parent and family childbirth classes, for example. We try to do this work through a culturally competent lens, right? So ensuring that people have material, resources, educators that reflect the diversity of our community, different languages that are spoken as well. So that community outreach is an important part of our mission as an organization. And our vision really is to provide a world-class patient experience to every person, every time. And that's really, a core of our values in our organization, respect and integrity. And then, as I said, leveraging those community partners to address areas where we may not have the expertise, but we know we have plenty of academic partners, community-based partners, faith-based partners that can really meet the needs of our communities.
That's fantastic. You use the term cultural competencies. I've also heard the term cultural humilities as well. And I wonder if you could say more about that and its importance in healthcare. I think this is such an important lens and basis for how we approach healthcare. Can you say a little bit more about what that means and how Adventist Healthcare goes about approaching that?
Sure. Yeah, we focus on cultural competence, but also cultural responsiveness. So being able to understand our the values, the beliefs, the practices of the people that we serve, and then tailoring our healthcare delivery to meet those social, cultural, and linguistic needs. But we also have a learning mindset. So that responsiveness is being able to understand what their needs are in the community. How can we meet those needs? What do we need to learn ongoing to be able to provide care that is in line with a person's, diet, what language they need their materials in for, sustaining their health. We want to make sure that our healthcare professionals are not only aware of the diversity and the disparities that people face in our community, but that they're equipped, right, to provide interpreter services that are in line with the top languages that we see among our patient populations, to ensure that communities that that have high disparities in chronic diseases, mental illnesses, that we have a workforce that is equipped to provide that quality care and to provide it in ways that meet the preferences and the needs of our population. So that's our approach to being responsive to our community that is so culturally diverse.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's a really nice segue to talking about your role as the leader on equity, diversity, inclusion in Adventist Healthcare. So you've talked about having a workforce that can be responsive to the community, that how critical that is, but you've also talked about the importance of leadership positions and diversity across Adventist, not only for representation of the community, but for innovation and for, really pushing the boundaries and being the best healthcare provider you can. Can you share with us how you approach your role as executive director of equity, diversity, inclusion? What are some of the foundational guidelines that you use, or the way you see your responsibilities in this role?
Sure. So I would say that we start out with a purpose that everybody can come together on, a common purpose. And for us, it's to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion in our programs, policies, and practices. I try to be an influencer within the organization. So bringing together and collaborating with our leaders, senior leaders, as well as frontline staff. We have a steering committee that focuses on ensuring that we can cultivate EDI in our messages, in our statements, in how we present ourselves. We try to establish a shared vocabulary across the organization. So I think that's a really important part of my role, is to say, how do we define things like cultural competence or humility? How do we define equity, diversity, and inclusion? And then what is each individual's role in advancing EDI in their own work? So if you are somebody who is a recruiter, how to take bias out of hiring decisions. If you are someone that is focusing on community health, how to ensure that the way that you teach them really focuses on their level of education, their health literacy as well, and their language, as I've mentioned before. All of these things do tie into our strategic plan, but also align with our mission as an organization, our values, and our vision. And it's about making sure that we have a foundation where everyone not only has some shared language, but shared information. So again, training and education is really important about building an inclusive environment. What does that look like? How can leaders lead and play a role model for others in the organization to really implement our strategic plan?
Yeah, no, that's terrific. Thank you for sharing that. Here at the universities at Shady Grove, our student population really reflects the wonderful diversity of the county, and we work hard every day to try to ensure not only a diverse campus, but a more inclusive campus and a more equitable campus, especially in educational delivery more generally. What are some of the challenges, or what are some of the priorities that educational institutions in particular, do you think, need to be focused on in really developing a more equitable, diverse, and inclusive space, not only for the staff and the faculty and the teams who are delivering the services, but for the students as well? What do you see as some of the priorities for educational institutions in particular?
Yeah, I think making sure that there's a broad representation, as you mentioned, across campus, being deliberate about the recruitment, the offerings that are available to students from different backgrounds. We are always looking to hire qualified and diverse talent, and especially in healthcare, especially now, there are a lot of barriers to doing that. And we want to make sure that we have provided opportunities for people that have experience already, maybe in a different field or different area, or how they can take the knowledge and skill that they're building in their programs and apply it. Practical knowledge is really important. In one of the classes that I teach at University of Maryland, College Park, I provide an opportunity for the students to attend community coalition meetings. Right. And part of that practical experience is to really understand, how can I take the work that I learn as a student in public health and understand how is it being applied? What are people talking about in terms of the issues? What do these meetings look like? What are the issues that are really important? And then what are some of the barriers or the approaches that might be used to address issues like, getting the COVID-19 vaccine disseminated? So those practical experiences, I think that's really key for students to have, while they're learning, but to also be able to learn from other individuals who've had experience already out in the field, whether they're working or not, and to maybe integrate that into learning opportunities, classes, and other capstone projects, things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a really, really helpful. And you hear this from students too, that this kind of hands-on experience is so important for them as well. We've often in higher education focused a lot on diversity and wanting to have diverse student body, diverse faculty. But oftentimes I think it comes down to, you may have a diverse community, but is it an inclusive community? Is the community one where everybody feels welcome and everyone feels supported? I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that difference between the goal of diversity, perhaps, but also the importance of inclusivity in that process, and what do you think it means to have an inclusive community that can support great diversity?
Sure. Yeah, when we talk about diversity, we think about the collective mixture of all the characteristics and backgrounds and experiences and expertise that we can share, or that may be different. Diversity is just representation, right? So we could have a diverse group of people represented, on a group or in leadership, but that may not mean that each of their voices are heard, that they feel like they fully belong, or that they're valued and respected. That's inclusion. Verna Myers talks about this and says that if diversity is being invited to the party, then inclusion is being asked to dance. And I've even heard that, it's being part of the event planning, the party planning committee.
Yeah.
So being able to really feel that they are, individuals are involved, that they're engaged, that they can fully contribute to create business value or value within an organization. That's really our goal. So we aim to build this inclusive environment at Adventist Healthcare by acknowledging that we have a very diverse workforce, acknowledging that we have a talented workforce that can contribute to achieving our mission at the organization, but also making sure that we're equipping people to be able to do that, right? So again, having that shared vocabulary, having training and education. We also think about how we're preparing people for the future, so succession planning or having career pathways, especially in healthcare. That's really important. So having a diverse workforce that can represent the community, and then bringing in new employees, sometimes through our nurse preceptor programs. We have a business intern program. And so being able to have those pathways for individuals, that's how we can create a more inclusive environment.
Those are great examples. Thank you for that. I really appreciate those examples. I've been doing some reading about this very difficult job market for hiring people. I know in healthcare, there's a real shortage of all healthcare workers. We need more and more employees. But this is also a time, coming out of COVID, but it's also a generational shift, I think. Employees or potential employees are placing different emphasis and different priorities in their decision about whether or not to take a job.
Wow.
And what appears more and more in this decision-making calculus is the organization diverse? Is it inclusive? And is it equitable? Does it represent the values that I believe in? And I think that this is something that's going to be, it's wonderful that potential employees are seeking out workplaces that are representative and inclusive and equitable. But I don't know if all employers are ready for this. And I'm wondering what your perspective is on this. Someone who's a leader in this effort on the forefront, and clearly Adventist Healthcare is one of the leaders in this area as well. But when you think broadly across the economy and across different businesses, what do you see? What are the trends you're seeing in terms of the embrace of equity, diversity, and inclusion as a priority, and how new employees, maybe younger professionals coming to the market, how they are perhaps changing and influencing the way that organizations are approaching leadership with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yeah. On the new workforce, right? The younger generations, and we have like 5 generations in the workplace right now. They're really looking for places where they can have strong purpose, where they can have that connection to the mission of the organization and feel like they are contributing something that is really in line with their own values I think they're also looking for a place where they can not only feel like they're included and belong, but that they can be themselves. So that authenticity, we're seeing a lot of that happening, like how to have a workplace where people can be their authentic selves. We talked a lot about this shift right after the pandemic, and focusing on Black Lives Matter, that we started having conversations internally about race. And it's a difficult topic for people to talk about, but we understood that people needed the space to be able to talk about what's important to them, what concerns they might have. So definitely seeing a trend in the workforce where people want to have that safe space to be psychologically safe within their workforce to talk about that. And I do think it can be difficult for some organizations and some leaders to be able to do that. But I think humility, I think vulnerability are really important aspects of a strong servant leader. And we try to kind of focus on creating that kind of an environment. I think the other is just being aware of environmental changes, social political changes, economic changes happening around us, and thinking about our governance is really important. So there's a lot of buzz around ESG, which is environmental, socially, and governance, and so being able to think about how I understand what is the context that people are living in, how we are working, what our societal institutions look like, and then how we're creating this environment within our own organization to prepare people, right, for having a diverse boards that are diverse, but also are requiring leaders to provide dashboards that show, like, how are we being intentional? How are we preparing our workforce to meet the needs of a growing population of people from different backgrounds with different needs? That's really where I think we're seeing this shift within organizations, as being more open and being more vulnerable to be able to talk about topics that we may have felt challenges talking about in the past, but also finding that people are coming to organizations looking for that opportunity to be authentic and to do this hard work.
I think your focus on the desire to be authentic is so important. When I think about my own experience, coming out of college, and, everybody wanted to dress the same and like fit the mode. And, it was, I'm going to date myself, but like everyone wanted to wear the padded shoulder pads and, the certain suit, and, everyone was expected to look a certain way, right, when in the workplace. And now this focus on authenticity and people, being themselves in the workplace so they can be fully creative and fully engaged. It is a big shift for corporations and for organizations that have set a certain culture, or really reinforced a very particular culture that expects more of uniformity. And so I think this is a challenge. And so, as you say, that vulnerability or that humility is so important to learn and to adjust and to grow. So thank you for sharing that. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your role as chair of the board of directors of Leadership Montgomery. This is a wonderful organization in Montgomery County that focuses on building leadership skills through broad community and network building and peer-to-peer learning. And could you talk a little bit about why you're interested in serving as chair of the board of directors of this organization, and how your leadership in Leadership Montgomery relates to the work you're doing at Adventist as well?
Sure, yeah. When I went to Leadership Montgomery, I participated in their core program for execs, and this was in 2017. So I just remember how I was so just surprised at how little I knew about Montgomery County, even though I had lived here for such a long time. But it was an opportunity for all of us, really, in our cohort program, to not only learn about the different sectors in our county and how they worked, economic, education, healthcare, public safety, but to really understand what our roles were as leaders, to be influential, to participate civically, in our community, to make Montgomery County the best county that we could be. I came back and never really, actually, I never really left, I guess. After I completed my program, I was asked by C. Marie Taylor, the CEO at the time, to join the board. And I was very happy to do that because that experience transformed me as a leader. I created a great network of leaders. So I knew that if there was an area where I needed some support or some more information, I knew where to go to. I was able to understand how my role in healthcare could address the needs of people outside of healthcare. And so being able to continue to participate in those ways was important. I served as a co-chair on our corporate engagement, our partnerships committee, and then later became vice chair and chair, again, right around the time when we were about to have change within the organization, and also important change around focusing on racial equity. So that's where the connection between the work I'm doing and my service on the board, which actually ends at the end of this month, came together. Being able to really talk about the importance of racial equity, the history of race, not only in our country, but specifically in our local area. And then being able to focus on strategic planning. I was part of the inaugural cohort of our Real Inclusion program. And that 8-month program brought together organizations and leaders to think about strategic planning. And that's part of what we are implementing now at Adventist Healthcare. So really nice culmination of my role on Leadership Montgomery's board and the work that I'm doing now. And we actually have a race equity committee that focuses not only on our external work, but also our work as a board. How are we continuing to keep race equity at the forefront when we're making decisions about our work within the organization?
Fantastic. It's really fascinating to me how you've interwoven and built on so many interesting parts of your career that have really come together in such a powerful way in the role you play now, but across the county as well. So that's fantastic. You ended on that note just now about keeping diversity, equity, inclusion in the forefront. And I think this is so important. A lot of times we approach a cultural shift or an effort to build inclusion almost as, let's implement the pilot and then we're there. But the work is ongoing. It's continuous. It's never done. And I wonder, could you talk a little bit about what it's like and what's required to keep this work moving forward? I think continuous improvement is something that's been with us in organizational theory and learning and organizational change for a long time. And we know one thing about it, it's hard. Continuous improvement is hard. There's a natural desire to want to kind of settle and find a rhythm and, as opposed to continuously leaning into change and leaning into challenge. But I think that this work requires us to embrace that, not only the humility, but to really lean into it and be open to that continuous change and to have leadership that's constantly encouraging us and showing us the way. Could you talk about that? And what are some of the ways you approach that challenge in your own leadership?
Sure. Yeah, I think one of the sad parts about time and having to be in the pandemic is that priorities shift very quickly. And I've even found that there's a waning interest in focusing on sustaining the work to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion societally, as well as within organizations. Having that strategic plan, I think, is a major foundation for being able to keep it sustained over time. Having governance so that there are leaders who are tasked with ensuring that we can cultivate that work within the organization. I think that's also very important. And then the relationships, and I mentioned that earlier, really important to create allies within the organization. Because even though my role is equity, diversity, and inclusion, I partner with our leader for supply chain management to make sure that we're focusing on supplier diversity. I collaborate with our VP for mission to really ensure that within our message of mission and values, that people see the connection with EDI. So it's really important to think about the communication, how we're communicating effectively across the organization, the work that we're doing, and then having governance, structures in place so that we can sustain things over time. The other thing is that we have a bias at our organization for performance excellence, which means that we are always looking for opportunities to kind of monitor how well we're doing, right? So we can say, we've got these processes in place. How well are we doing? Where do we need to improve? And then what are the actions that we need to take? Do we need to collaborate? Do we need to look at the data a little bit differently? But we always try to be data driven and focused on process improvement. And so that's the continuous learning and the continuous work, meaning that we're always going to set a target, but we're always going to try to exceed that target, and that will require continuous work. So that's the part that, keeping people engaged, communicating what we're doing as an organization, as well as how we can engage people to continue the work at their own local levels.
Fantastic. Just to wrap up our conversation, and this has been so interesting, Marilyn, it's been terrific. I wonder if you could talk a little about where you see diversity, equity, inclusion, and healthcare going. You've indicated that, you've talked a lot about the community engagement, cultural competencies, and cultural humility. You talked about how difficult it is sometimes to sustain this work because of shifting priorities and resources. What does the next 10 years look like, do you think, in terms of healthcare and becoming a more diverse, inclusive, and equitable service as well as profession?
Yeah, I think in terms of service, we'll find that the customer is going to be the center. When we want to achieve our mission, when we want to provide high quality healthcare services, we have to put the person in the center. So that's why the Institute of Medicine talks about patient-centered and equitable care. We want to make sure that everybody receives, the best care and services, no matter what their background, right? So that's really going to be very important. I think the other is to ensure that we are always ahead of the ball, right? So knowing, what's coming down the pike politically. So policy change is really going to be quite important for organizations to continue sustaining change over time, because we know that people are looking for action. They want to see meaningful change in organizations. So things that we can count, things where we can find performance improvements, where we can find policy change, and then just having programs in place that are going to meet the needs of this changing workforce, especially as we have newer generations coming into the workforce, as we're continuing to partner with our partner organizations in the community to meet the needs of workforce when they have families to take care of, when they have other responsibilities outside of work. So really caring for the whole person, I think, is the direction that we need to be going in. And that also includes, like in the education field, being able to help people with affordable education, right? So how can we support people to get those degrees? Because having and I read the statistics about having, by maybe in another few years, you're going to have a high demand for people that are college educated. But what can we do for those individuals who maybe have been facing barriers getting that college education? I think that's really going to be key if we're going to build a sustainable workforce in the future.
Absolutely. And building on the partnership that USG has with Adventist, and really thinking, to your point about experience and experiential learning and clinical care, the importance of thinking about the educational journey in conjunction with the professional journey as well, and how together we can not only serve more students equitably and a greater diversity of our students, but also ensure that they have great careers at the end as well, where they can thrive as their authentic selves as well. So Marilyn, thank you so much for a wonderful conversation today. I'm so grateful I've learned so much and really appreciate your time.
Great, thanks, Anne. It was great to be here.